Well, hello everyone. This is Grace of gbmaltese, and I thought I would do diamond painting in a story today. The story I have chosen is The Golden-Headed Fish. Once upon a time, there lived in Egypt a king who had lost his sight from a bad illness. Of course, he was very unhappy and became more so as months passed, and all the best doctors in the land were unable to cure him. The poor man grew so thin from misery that everyone thought he was going to die, and the prince, his only son, thought so too. Great, therefore, was the rejoicing throughout Egypt when a traveler down the river Nile declared he was court physician to the king of a far country, and would gladly, if he was allowed, examine the eyes of the blind man. He was at once admitted into the royal presence, and after a few minutes of careful study, announced that the king's case, though very serious, was not entirely hopeless. "Somewhere in the great sea," he said to the king, "there exists a golden-headed fish. If you can manage to catch this creature and bring it to me, I will prepare an ointment from its blood which will restore your sight. For 100 days I will wait here. But if at the end of that time the fish should still not be caught, I must return to my own master." Well, the next morning the young prince set forth in quest of the fish, taking with him 100 men, each carrying a net. A little fleet of boats was waiting for them, and in these they sailed to the middle of the great sea. For 3 months and more, they labored diligently from sunrise to sunset. But though they caught large multitudes of fishes, not one of them possessed a golden head. "It is quite useless now," said the prince on the very last night, "for even if we find it this evening, the 100 days will be over in an hour, and long before we could reach the Egyptian capital, the doctor will be on his way home. Still, I will go out and cast the net once more myself." And the prince did. And at the very moment that the 100 days given to him were up, he drew up his net and found the golden-headed fish entangled in its meshes. "Success has come, but as often happens, it is too late," murmured the young man who had studied in the schools of philosophy. "All the same, put the fish in that vessel full of water, and we will take it back. Then my father will know that we have done what we could." But when he drew near the fish, it looked up at him with such piteous eyes that he could not make up his mind to condemn it to death. For he knew well that, though the doctors of his own country were ignorant of the secret of the ointment, they would do everything in their power to extract something from the fish's blood. He picked up the prize of so much labor and threw it back into the sea, and then began his journey home to the palace. When at last the prince reached it, he found the king in a high fever caused by his disappointment, and he refused to believe the story told him by his son. "Your head shall pay for it! Your head shall pay for it!" cried he, and he bade his courtiers instantly summon the executioner to the palace. Somebody ran at once to the queen and told her of the king's order. She put common clothes on the prince, filled his pockets with gold, and hurried him on board a ship which was sailing that very night for a distant island. "Your father will repent of this some day, and then he will be thankful to know that you are still alive," she said to her son. "But one last counsel will I give you. Take no man into your service who desires to be paid every month." The young prince thought this advice rather odd. If a servant had to be paid anyhow, he did not understand what difference it could make whether it was by the year or by the month. However, he had many times learned that his mother was wiser than he, so he promised obedience. After a voyage of several weeks, the prince arrived at the island of which his mother had spoken. It was full of hills and woods and flowers, and beautiful white houses stood everywhere in gardens. What a charming spot to live in, thought the prince, and he lost no time in buying one of the prettiest of the dwellings. Then servants came pressing to offer their services, but as they all declared that they must have payment at the end of every month, the young man declined to hire them. At length, an Arab appeared one morning, begging the prince to engage him. And what wages do you ask?" inquired the prince, when he had questioned the newcomer and found him suitable. "I do not want money," answered the Arab. "At the end of a year, you can see what my services are worth to you, and can pay me in whatever way you like." The young man was pleased and took the Arab for his servant. Now, although no one would have guessed it from the look of the part of the island where the prince had landed, the other side of the island was a complete desert, owing to the ravages of a horrible sea monster which devoured all the corn and cattle. The governor had sent bands of soldiers to lie in wait for the creature in order to kill it. But somehow, none ever happened to be awake at the moment that the ravages were committed. It was in vain that the sleepy soldiers had been punished severely. The same thing invariably occurred next time a group went out to watch. At last, heralds went throughout the island to offer a great reward to the man who could slay the sea beast. As soon as the Arab heard the news, he went straight to the governor's palace. "If my master can succeed in killing the monster, what reward will you give him?" asked he. "My daughter, and anything besides that he chooses," answered the governor. The Arab shook his head. "Give him your daughter, and keep your wealth," said he. "But henceforth let her share in your gains, whatever they are." "It is well," replied the governor, and ordered a deed to be prepared, which was signed by both of the men. That night the Arab stole down to the shore to watch. But before setting out, he had rubbed himself with an oil which made his skin hurt so badly that there was no chance of his going to sleep as the soldiers had done. Then he hid himself behind a large rock and waited. By and by, a swell seemed to rise on the water, and, after a few minutes, a hideous monster, part bird, part beast, and part serpent, stepped noiselessly onto the rocks. It walked stealthily up toward the fields, but the Arab was ready for it, and when it passed, he plunged his dagger into the soft flesh behind one ear. The creature staggered and gave a loud cry and rolled over dead. The Arab watched for a little while in order to make sure there was no life left in his enemy. Since the huge body remained quite still, he quit his hiding place and cut off the beast's ears. These he carried to his master, bidding him show them to the governor and declare that he himself and no other had killed the monster. "But it was you and not I who slew him," objected the prince. "Never mind. Do what I bid you. I have a reason for it," answered the Arab. And although the young man did not like taking credit for what he had not done, he finally gave in. The governor was so delighted at the news that he begged the prince to marry his daughter that very day. But the prince refused, saying that all he desired was a ship which would carry him to see the world. Of course, this was granted him at once, and when he and his faithful Arab embarked, they found heaped up in the vessel stores of diamonds and many other precious stones, which the grateful governor had placed there for him. So they sailed, and they sailed, and they sailed, and at length they reached the shores of a great kingdom. Leaving the prince on board, the Arab went into the town to find out what sort of place it was. After some hours he returned, saying he had heard that the king's daughter was the most beautiful princess in the world, and that the prince would do well to ask for her hand in marriage. The prince listened to his advice, and taking some of the finest necklaces given him by the governor, he mounted a splendid horse which the Arab had bought for him. He rode up to the palace, closely followed by his faithful attendant. The strange king happened to be in a good humor, and they were readily admitted to his presence. Laying down his offerings on the steps of the throne, the prince requested the king to grant him his daughter in marriage. Well, the monarch listened to him in silence, but finally answered, "Young man, I will give you my daughter to wed, if that is what your wish is. But first, I must tell you that she has already gone through the marriage ceremony with 190 young men, and not one of them lived more than 12 hours. I advise you to think while there is yet time." The prince was so frightened that he very nearly went back to his ship without any more words. But just as he was about to withdraw his proposal, the Arab whispered to him, "Fear nothing, the king says, but take her." "Well, the luck must change sometime," he said at last. "And who would not risk his head for the hand of the peerless princess?" "As you will," replied the king. "Since you wish it, I will give orders for the marriage to be celebrated tonight." And so it was done. After the ceremony was performed, the bride and bridegroom retired to their own apartment to eat by themselves, for such was the custom of the country. The moon shone bright, and the prince walked to the window to look over the river and upon the distant hills, when his gaze suddenly fell on a silken shroud, a grave shroud, neatly laid out on a couch, with his name embroidered in gold thread across the front. For this was the pleasure of the king. Horrified at the spectacle, he turned his head away, and this time his glance rested on a group of men digging busily beneath his window. It was a strange hour for anyone to be at work. And what was the hole for? It was a curious shape, so long and narrow, almost like... yes, that's what it was. It was his grave they were digging. The shock of the discovery rendered him speechless, yet he stood fascinated and unable to move. At this moment, a small black snake darted from the mouth of the princess, who was seated at the table, and it wriggled quickly toward him. But the Arab had hidden himself in the room and was secretly watching for something of the sort to happen. Seizing the serpent with a pair of pincers he had been holding in his left hand, he cut off his head with a sharp dagger. The king could hardly believe his eyes when early the next morning his new son-in-law craved an audience with his majesty. "What, you?" he cried as the young man entered his presence. "Yes, I. Why not?" asked the bridegroom, who thought it best to pretend not to know anything that had occurred. "You remember I told you that the luck must turn at last, and so it has. But I came to ask whether you would be so kind as to bid the gardeners fill up a great hole right underneath my window. It spoils the view." "Oh, certainly. Yes, of course, it shall be done," stammered the king. "Is there anything else?" "No, "Nothing, thank you," replied the prince as he bowed and withdrew. Now, from the moment the Arab cut off the snake's head, the spell or enchantment, whatever it was, seemed to have been taken off the princess, and she lived very happily with her husband. The days passed swiftly in hunting in the forest or sailing on the broad river that flowed past the palace, and when night fell, she would sing to her harp, or the prince would tell tales of his own country. One evening, a man in strange clothes, with a face burned brown by the sun, arrived at court. He asked to see the bridegroom, and falling on his face before the prince announced that he was a messenger sent by the Queen of Egypt, proclaiming him king now, in succession to his father, who was dead. "Her Majesty begs you to set forth without delay, and your bride also, as the affairs of the kingdom are somewhat in disorder," ended the messenger. Then the young man hastened to seek an audience with his father-in-law, who was delighted to find that his daughter's husband was not merely the governor of a province, as he had supposed, but the king of a powerful country. He at once ordered a splendid ship to be made ready for the young couple, and in a week's time rowed down to the harbor to bid farewell to the new ruler and his bride. In spite of her grief for the dead king, the queen was overjoyed to welcome her son home, and commanded the palace to be hung with colorful banners to honor his bride. The people expected great things from the new sovereign, for they had suffered much under the harsh rule of the old one, and crowds presented themselves every morning with petitions which they hoped to persuade the king to grant. Truly, the new king had enough to keep him busy, but he was very happy for all of it. Until one night, the Arab came to him and begged permission to return to his own land. Filled with dismay, the young man said, "Leave me? Do you really wish to leave me?" Sadly, the Arab bowed his head. "No, my master, never could I wish to leave you. But I have received a summons, and I dare not disobey it." The young king was silent, trying to choke down the grief which he felt at the thought of losing his faithful servant. "Well, I must not try to keep you," he faltered at last. "That would be a poor return for everything you have done for me. Everything I have is yours. Take what you will, for without you, I should long ago have been dead." "And without you, I too should long ago have been dead," answered the Arab, "for I am the golden-headed fish." And that is the end. I thought the ending was quite special. I wasn't sure when the golden fish might appear again, but that was his sweet Arabian companion. We never know who we might be helping in this world, and we need to learn to show kindness to all, and I think that kind of is what I get from that story. I really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and tell me, have you ever heard that story before? That was my first time to have ever read it, and I liked it so much I thought that I'd share it with you guys. Anyway, I'm going to let you go for now. I hope you're enjoying whatever it is that you're doing. Take care. God bless. I wish you all the happiness that anyone could have, all the joy. Take care of yourselves, guys. I love you very much. Bye.